Hello and welcome, my name is Winford Dorr, and today I want to go through why it is so many symptoms, different symptoms exist in the whole autistic spectrum. So I'm going to be talking about what are the neurological root causes for many of the symptoms that actually limit the quality of life for our families. You know, what's really sad is that there's so much confusion out there, because there is good science there, but it's good science that's not yet being shared. So our children are still being treated badly, still being misunderstood, sometimes even taken advantage of, sometimes given false promises. I also want to touch on what is now known about the whole concept of neuroplasticity, and to discuss with you whether this really does provide hope. Some of you might know me as the author of Stop Struggling in School, which is on Amazon, and goes into a lot more detail that I'm able to share with you today. But the real reason I'm here is, after 20 years working in this area, I'm still absolutely passionate about it, because once I was exactly where you are right now. You know, my own daughter struggled badly with development, and no one could give the explanations that made sense. So she struggled, she was in pain, and of course the family was in pain. And my experience of all of these developmental challenges led me to research it, to make connections with amazing researchers and start to piece together exactly what is it that's happening. What can we do about it that isn't currently being shared? So my daughter Susie was my original driving force, and she took me from being a businessman to a warrior dad on a mission. And it was serious. She didn't want to live, and so I had to throw caution to the wind. And because everything that she'd been offered had not worked for her. So I'm sure many of you will understand why I can feel what you feel right now. So here's Susie. And this was taken a few years ago. You might recognise the difference in the picture. Time has moved on. I've been involved with this for over 20 years now. But I was honoured and privileged to meet various amazing professors, and especially one that was at that time at Sheffield University, Professor Rod Nicholson, because he gave me lots of amazing clues about where to look, where to find answers, where to piece together the research. And this was information that, sadly, was just being kept inside very small circles of academic researchers. It wasn't reaching the people that needed it. It wasn't reaching the families. It wasn't reaching the teachers and the therapists. And I've made it my job to share with you whatever I've learned and whatever I've come across and piece together. But what seems to be happening is that there are many different disciplines in the whole academic community, but they're not talking to each other. They're not realizing that what is a breakthrough in one discipline can be applied in another area. And if you piece it together, you get this most amazing jigsaw. You know, my prediction is, for what I'm going to share with you right now, is that we need a new discipline to pull together the pertinent research that hasn't been understood before. But what's happening right now is that there's pain, there's huge pain. The confusion is causing pain. The whole process of diagnosis isn't helping either, because many families will tell you they've taken their child to 3 or more specialists and they've got 3 or more different diagnoses. Well, does that increase or reduce the confusion? Well, of course it increases the confusion. And that's so sad. It's the last thing families need when they've got the pressure of a child with ASD symptoms. So I want to get quickly to what is the root cause, not what is the symptoms, we know enough about that. What is the root cause of these issues? Well, here's a big list. In fact, there's 2 big lists here. And the lists here are under different headings. I've got one under the heading of cerebellum, and I'm going to explain to you exactly the implications of and the reasons why I've done that. And the other list has got prefrontal cortex. That's the thinking brain area here at the front. And those 2 lists have been deliberately put like that, and I'm going to go through every one of those symptoms. And I wouldn't be surprised if you'll have in your family several of those symptoms. You won't have them all. It's very unlikely, very rare that you do, but you probably have several of them. So the group 1 is the skills or the automatic processes that haven't been fully developed, and the second is the lack of controls in the brain. and that's happening in the prefrontal cortex. So these are the things I'm going to explain to you, and I'm hoping it's going to make an awful lot of sense. So where is the cerebellum? Cerebellum is at the back. The brain here, it's really has been overlooked. It's only tiny, it's only 10% of the whole brain, but it's actually 3/4 of all of our brain cells. And yet it's been overlooked, it's been misunderstood, because for decades, neuroscientists assumed that it had got one simple job, and that was to coordinate our balance and movement. And yet neuroscience have been saying for 30 years or more now, no, it's doing far, far more than just involved in our sensory motor function. It's involved actually in everything we develop and everything we do. It is the brain within the brain. It is the master junction box. Yes, it's the coordinator of our motor skills, but it also coordinates our emotions and lots of other things in our cognition. In fact, Jeremy Schmarman, the professor at Harvard Medical School, he has made it very, very clear that it is the master coordinator. So I was fortunate enough to be introduced to him some 20 or so years ago, and I realized 20 years on, he is still being ignored. Yes, a professor at Harvard Medical School is being ignored. So he's taught us an awful lot about how the cerebellum makes connections, whether they're right or wrong. It's the area where we get good at things. When the cerebellum is doing its job, we become a natural at what we're trying to do, or we don't, as the case may be. So whether it's learning, whether it's reading, whether it's skill development, this part of the brain, the cerebellum, is the center we need to focus on. And ironically, it's where our potential is hiding. Now, isn't it strange that something as important as this is being ignored, is being left off so many MRI scans, even to this day? So many diagrams of the brain don't even mention the cerebellum. They mention everything else, but they miss off the bit that's got 3/4 of our brain cells. Imagine the power of it and how crazy it is that it's been ignored. Well, that's been the case for the last 30 years, and we need to change that, because our families that have got a child or even an adult with autistic spectrum, we need to understand this area, and we need to become obsessed with it. The medical world has become obsessed with giving drugs to deal with any issues in the brain, with cognition, with mood, or even with skill development. They rely on drugs. Well, science is now showing us it is possible to make better connections in the cerebellum. Now, isn't this a hint at neuroplasticity? To me, it's the missing link in our whole approach to understanding learning difficulties, and specifically autism. So what I'm going to share with you today fits beautifully with so many other interventions too, and can enhance them and make them more powerful, whether it's chiropractic therapy or physical therapy or even psychology. So let's start looking at just how do these skills or processes happen, how do they develop in the cerebellum? Well, there it is at the back there, overlooked. I want it to become a really important part of your research and study in the future. So there's two parts of the brain that are responsible for learning things. And so there's two different types of learning. There's one type that's just about facts, about pictures, about things that you recall to your thinking brain. So anything you recall to your thinking brain that you think about, that's the hippocampus. Now that's one type of learning in the brain, but there's another very, very important type, and that's all of the automatized processes, the development of those things that we use but don't think about. So I'm talking about when you're standing up, you're balancing. You don't think about your balance, you do it automatically. Why? Because the cerebellum has created a process. When we're walking, when we're speaking, when we're listening and turning what we hear into thoughts we comprehend, when we're socializing, we're using social skills to interact with people, when we ride a bike or drive a car, all of these are processes that, if they're fully developed, they've been developed by the cerebellum, and we don't have to think about them. They're processes that happen in the subconscious, or they should be. So let's go over that again. There's two types of learning. One is facts, pictures, dates, and so on. All the things that we recall to our thinking brain. That's the hippocampus, and the other is what happens in the cerebellum. Now, it's really important that we get this because this is foundational to us understanding the cause of so many symptoms in autism. So if it is that we walk a bit clumsily, or we're a bit clumsy with socializing, or if it is that our speech isn't effortless and with total clarity, then it's because the necessary connections have not yet been made in the cerebellum by the cerebellum. So all of these skills, all of these processes, they need to be hardwired so that they're fully automatic, so that we don't have to think about it. So that's the role of the cerebellum. And in a few minutes I'll be sharing with you why it is the lack of the ability of the cerebellum, or lack of development within the cerebellum itself, leads in turn to the lack of development of key skills, key processes that we need and make life easy. So here's the picture of the cerebellum again, and this is the process of learning. First of all, we're thinking what to do. Where do we think? Up here in the prefrontal cortex. And when we practice and practice and practice something, it's the cerebellum that's turning that practice into hardwired processes. And when the cerebellum has finished its job, assuming it can finish its job, then we process all of those automatic things up in the cortex. That's the main part of the brain. Does that make sense? So the process of learning is we think what to do, we practice it, and the practicing causes the cerebellum to develop processes, rather like computer programs, that can be processed up in the cortex. So that's the process of learning. And the cerebellum does an awful lot of fine-tuning if it can. If it can't, it leaves us with incompletely developed skills. So what happens when we've got a poor skill, an incompletely developed skill? It requires conscious compensation. In other words, you've got to support the execution of that skill with some thought. We cruelly say sometimes of people that we can see their cogs whirring. So when a skill is fully developed, we're a natural at it. We don't have to think about it. We just do it. When it's not fully developed, we have to use some thought to support the process because it's not got a fully hardwired program there that's operating in our cortex. So is this making some sense? The conscious support is necessary because a skill hasn't been fully developed. And with autistic symptoms, you've got a lot of symptoms which are because there's not been the full development of the process of the skill. So whether it's listening, whether it's socializing, whether it's reading, you can actually see them thinking hard, working hard mentally as they try and process things. All because the cerebellum hasn't done its job. So there's a whole range of things that can cause this. Obviously the very process of learning we're talking about. So a child with autism often, not always, often, they will have difficulties learning basic learning skills. So for them, reading and attention and so on become difficult, all because the cerebellum hasn't finished off the automatized processes. So all of these symptoms here, they're direct links between symptoms of ASD and underdevelopment, lack of effectiveness of the cerebellum, poor coordination. Clearly, when the cerebellum cannot create the links between balance and movement, we're going to be a bit clumsy. There's going to be poor coordination. Obviously the cerebellum. But then practical things, like tying shoelaces. That's a fine motor skill. One of many roles of the cerebellum is to create hardwired fine motor skills so that doing up buttons, doing up shoelaces can all happen effortlessly without us having to think. And for some, of course, as we know, it's hard work. Development of speech. How big an impact does that have on so many with autism? Speech development is down to the cerebellum making the critical connections so that the process of speaking happens. When it's delayed, when it doesn't happen very well, when there's stuttering, when there's any fundamental issue with speech, you can trace it straight back to the cerebellum. So that's a direct consequence of lack of cerebellar development. What about spinning? So many with autism love spinning. What's going on? Well, as you can see in this diagram, you've got the inner ear, that's the vestibular area, and there's a lot of connections, or there should be a huge number of connections between the inner ear and the cerebellum. The more connections between inner ear and cerebellum, the better the cerebellum works. So in those with learning issues or developmental issues, very often there's lack of connections between vestibular, the balance organ, and the cerebellum, and as a result the cerebellum isn't powered up as much. It isn't able to do its job as much. But what happens with spinning? When you're spinning, you've got enormous amounts of stimulation coming from the vestibular, and it more than makes up for the lack of connections that exists in that person between vestibular and the cerebellum. So all of a sudden their cerebellum is working better, they feel better, they're happier. So you take a child with autism to a fairground ride, and very often they love it. It's the best time of the day or the week when they do that, because they're getting lots and lots of vestibular stimulation. Another issue is sensitivity to sound, sensitivity to touch. Sometimes it's oversensitivity, sometimes it's undersensitivity. Either way, the cerebellum is responsible for getting that right. It's responsible for the integration of all of our sensory inputs. And when it gets it wrong, it can be either overstimulated or understimulated by given sound or touch inputs. And that, of course, can make a child, or an adult for that matter, not very cuddly, because instead of the process of touching them and holding them being something they're comfortable with, they're not comfortable with, because the cerebellum hasn't integrated touch into their whole cognitive process, so it's actually uncomfortable rather than pleasurable. So I hope this is coming together for you. Motion sickness, another one that's quite common in children with learning issues, developmental issues. The cerebellum is responsible for coordinating all of our senses so that when we are moving, the brain can make sense of it. When it can't make sense of it, first of all, we're anxious, but secondly, we can often start throwing up and having motion sickness issues. And the final one on this list is hating change. To cope with change, we've got to have operational the very bit of the brain that hardwires our ability to cope with new processes. Well, that's what the cerebellum's all about. It's creating processes to deal with things that we're doing all the time. Well, if a new issue comes along and we haven't got the computer programmers inside the cerebellum able to create the new programs so that dealing with that becomes easy, then we're going to have a problem with change. Change is going to become really hard work for us. So that's the cerebellum. As you can see, it's directly responsible for making life easy or not easy, making us unnatural or not making us unnatural in so many critical areas. So, when we haven't got a fully automatized process, we have to think about it. And where do we think? Here in our prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain. It's the boss of the brain, actually. It's where decisions are made. It's where our executive functions are. So what we need to understand is that this important part of the brain, this thinking part of the brain, is actually, the processing in there is very, very slow. So for instance, when you're learning to ride a bike, you fall off whilst you're having to think about learning to ride a bike. In other words, when you're thinking, the processing is slow. And when it comes to riding a bike, you aren't able to ever ride it until you don't have to think. Why? Because processing in your thinking brain is too slow. Will you imagine the implications for that, for those with autism who've got a number of everyday skills that haven't yet been fully developed? They're having to compensate for that lack of development by thinking about them, and that thinking process is very slow, it's very hard work. And the other thing you must know about this is that conversely, when you can hardwire something, when you do hardwire it, when the cerebellum has finished its job, the processing happens up here in the cortex, where it's typically 100,000 times faster than in the thinking brain. So can you imagine the impact for that? It's not just faster, it's more precise, it's less mentally tiring. So all of the implications that directly stem from the cerebellum not being able to finish its job are huge for those with autistic symptoms. Something else we need to know about the thinking brain is that it's got much less capacity. At best, we can only take in about 7 things in our thinking brain. That's at best, and as we get older that goes down. And in the cortex there's almost unlimited capacity. So can you see this very busy bit of the brain, our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, is limited, and we're asking it to help out with all of those everyday processes. So what's the implications for that? Well, the implications for that is the very part of the brain that should be thinking, the very part of the brain that should be maintaining controls, the boss of the brain, is being impaired because it's having to do all sorts of things it shouldn't really be having to do. It's having to process. It's giving conscious compensation. So what else? What are these thinking controls? Well, the executive function is all about controlling attention, controlling impulsivity, controlling emotions and behavior. And when this part of the brain is full of stuff that shouldn't be there, all of these fundamental controls go out the window. It's also the area where you make decisions. It's the area where you think things through. So all of a sudden, you've got absolute overload in a critical part of the brain. So this is pretty serious stuff. And in a moment, I want to go into a few more of the symptoms that are affected directly by that. But a point I want to make now is that when the brain doesn't know what's happening next, it creates stress. We all know what stress is. And we are stressed more when the brain can't work out what's happening next. Well, one of the key roles of the cerebellum is to give us automaticity in dealing with things, so we don't have to know, we don't have to think about what's happening next. The brain knows in our subconscious. So one of the critical impacts of underdevelopment of the cerebellum is that we end up being more stressed because the brain can't work out what's happening next. So when the prefrontal cortex, when the thinking brain is having to compensate for poor skills, you've got less capacity to control. And the implications for that is huge. Yeah, we say horribly sometimes, we can see their cogs whirring, but boy, are they feeling pretty bad about it. So let's think about what are the specific implications of having this thinking brain full of stuff that shouldn't be there. The implications for having our cognitive functions, our executive functions, impaired. Well, here's another list of skills, of symptoms that those with ASD often show. Not always, but many of these are very common. Poor attention. Well, that comes directly because the prefrontal cortex, a thinking brain, is full of helping out the cerebellum because those skills haven't been developed, and therefore the very bit of the brain that should be having these executive functions, perfectly controlling everything we do, including attention, isn't able to operate. Organisation. To be organised, we need lots of thinking brain capacity. I think of it as rather like having lots of pigeonholes in my thinking brain. When my thinking brain is full of things that shouldn't be there, I've got no pigeonholes. I cannot be organised. I can't choose to be organised because I can't choose to have a huge amount of mental capacity where I need it, when I need it, because that only bit of brain that I can access, my thinking brain, is full of helping out with underdeveloped skills. Impulsivity. Well, the impulsivity is one of the functions of our executive control, and when this part of the brain where our executive functions are is fully overloaded, completely overloaded, impulsivity goes out the window. Likewise, risk-taking. Risk-taking involves us not being impulsive. Risk-taking involves us being able to take into account all of the information we should be taking into account. That means the short-term implications, the long-term implications. Well, when my thinking brain, which is where my decision-making happens, when my thinking brain is full of other things that shouldn't really be there, then I am going to be very poor at assessing risks and taking them. Stimming, likewise. There's a big link between stimming and overload in the prefrontal cortex, which affects the executive function. Likewise, repetitive behaviour, that's to do with impulsivity. OCD, all to do with the executive function having plenty of capacity. Poor emotional control. When your thinking brain is full, you have no capacity, no mental capacity left to control your emotions. So running out of emotional control is going to happen. Being deaf sometimes. Well, we all know what that's like in many. And as someone was saying to me earlier, her partner is like that. He hasn't got autism. So it's a common problem, not just with ASD. But when you haven't got mental capacity to process what you're hearing, then it's going to appear as if you're deaf. Likewise with eye contact. When visual processing hasn't been fully automatized, you need thinking brain capacity to turn what you're seeing into something you can comprehend. And that means that if that is a problem for you, then taking in information that you're seeing, what you're reading, the body language you're seeing, is going to be a step too far. You're not going to be able to do it. You don't have the mental capacity for it. Is this making some sense? I'm hoping so. So cerebellum, just to summarise, the cerebellum is where the problem starts, and when the cerebellum isn't doing its job, it will cause overload in the prefrontal cortex. So I'm hoping that many of these symptoms are making sense to you. Well, the billion-dollar question is, can you make the cerebellum do its job any better? Well, the answer is yes, and there's some wonderful research showing this, and the answer is in very specific types of exercise. You need to combine stimulation for the vestibular, which I touched on earlier, which makes the cerebellum work better, and if you do that right, you can drive the development of the cerebellum. You can actually enhance the plasticity of the cerebellum. And in actual fact, what's been now published in Nature, that famous scientific journal, is that when you put together the right simulations for the balance organ and the right challenge for the cerebellum, you can multiply the stem cells in the cerebellum, that very important part of the brain where you need further development. Isn't this exciting? So stimulating the inner ear, that's a certain type of balance, and challenging the cerebellum, that's the critical thing. That's the easy bit. The next bit is a bit more difficult because there's all sorts of different types of vestibular stimulation. There's rotation, there's lateral, there's anterior, there's posterior, there's vertical, all sorts of types of stimulation. Well, that's what I've spent 20 years working on, is how do we develop the cerebellum so that these fundamental skills can improve, and the consequence is so there's less demand put on our prefrontal cortex. Then those two big categories of symptoms are likely to all improve. So we need plasticity, we need stem cells in the cerebellum, and that's what these exercises are all about, because when you do that, you're developing more grey matter there, and the density of grey matter has been shown to improve, and then you get the skills improving. And the more improvement you get in the skills, the more skills are going to be processed in the cortex, and the less need for conscious help from this very busy control area. Well, you're going to be asking the question, what real life changes are there that can happen if we develop the cerebellum? Well, the answer is enormous. You know, I think the whole world's approach to learning, to autism, to ADHD, even to sports coaching is going to be different, because we now know those cognitive limitations which we thought we could either do nothing about or at best give some drugs to help cope with, can now be impacted by doing very carefully chosen exercises that increase plasticity and multiply the stem cells at the very junction box of the brain that can make all the difference to our various limitations. So the impact at the economic level is huge. But education systems need to start studying neuroscience. That's why we need different disciplines to benefit from all this amazing research that's coming out. So it's not just teaching and practice that education needs to be focusing on. It needs to be focusing on the ability to learn, the ability for the brain to hardwire these skills. And it also explains why those with autism, they haven't been able to cope with change. They haven't been able to adapt, because the very process of adapting requires the cerebellum to be able to create new circuits for us. But the wonderful news is that rapid catch-up is also possible, because actually even though the cerebellum hasn't been able to finish off these skills, it has been storing the attempts to learn those skills. But that's a whole new topic which I haven't got time for now. But believe me, the prospects for implementing this is very exciting, and it's what I've spent the last 20 years working with over 45,000, nearly 50,000 people. You may well be thinking, well, why does the problem start in the cerebellum? Well, that's an interesting question. That's a big topic which I don't have time for now, but it's a vulnerable place, especially in humans. When lambs are born, when calves are born, the cerebellum is actually well developed at birth. In the farm next door to me, they're jumping around within hours, they're feeding, they're playing together. Human babies don't do that for at least 2 or 3 years. So there's a huge amount of development to take place in human babies. And research is showing that in autism the cerebellum has developed differently. Why? Well, there's all sorts of arguments and debates going on about that. I'm not going to enter into that. But just to say that the cerebellum is very sensitive to the presence of toxins. It's very sensitive to trauma, especially during pregnancy. And what happens in those first years has enormous impact. But another interesting point is, when someone drinks a lot of alcohol, where does it go? Well, one of the places it goes to is the cerebellum. And what's it do there? It short circuits out some of those critical connections, and what had been fully developed skills like balance and speech and appropriateness can go out of the window. Why? Because the very part of the brain that masterminds those connections is being interfered with. So I can't go into much more detail about that, but maybe it's a topic for another talk one day. But suffice to know that the cerebellum is the root cause of these issues. So you'll find more on our website at Zinc Performance. You can have a look there. And what we've done to create this, to create a program that takes all the pain out of developing and providing these exercises, is we've come up with personalized programs for autistic folk, for young children with ADHD and so on, even for athletes that want to perfect their skills to a higher level. So there are programs there that we can talk about at another time. But look at these results. This is our own data. This has not been peer reviewed and published yet, but from our own data we get 95% improving in 5 important key areas, and more than 50% improve in 8 key areas. So is that encouraging? Is this telling you that neuroplasticity can make a difference? Yes, it is, and I think that means there is huge hope out there. And there's been a number of wonderful medical folk, medical experts. You might know some of them. Dr. Daniel Amen. This is what he said. The studies we published on autism and ADHD and ADD and traumatic brain injury all have cerebellar components to them. So now we have a way to optimize the cerebellum. Dr. Ned Hallowell, the best-selling author on ADHD, he's become a big fan of this approach. And Dr. Albert Menser, that many of you will have known because he's attended so many times to the Autism One conference. He says it's opened up an entire spectrum of what we now understand to be correctable conditions and the science behind them. So everything I've shared with you and much more, you'll find it on the Zinc Performance website, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, and there's much more to come. But please don't expect mainstream medicine to be bringing this to you anytime soon, and I know that you need it now. So whether you're a warrior parent, a warrior teacher, a warrior therapist, or even a warrior healthcare provider, please seek it out. The rewards for doing so is so thrilling. So a big thanks to Ed and the Autism One team for creating this conference. It's doing amazing work. And thanks to you for showing interest in this particular topic, neuroscience. Many are not looking this deeply at the underlying causes. And if you're intrigued and you want access to more research or other information, please contact me. I'll be more than happy to share it with you. All the best for now.